The only thing we have left with William Tyndale's life, is his death. So let's start with that this morning. We'll finish that up, and then we're going to start into another man's life. We'll probably do half of the next man. Toward the end of, and you're pretty much familiar with the dates. And by the way, don't be too concerned about these dates. It gets more, we'll start having more dates because the translations come more often as we work our way through this, one on the heels of another. And it's impossible to remember all who's king or who's queen or who's Archbishop of Canterbury or who's the Pope. It's pretty much impossible to remember all of that. Just keep vague things in your mind, that Wycliffe and his work is the end of the 1300s and Tyndale's the beginning of the 1500s. And we've got many of them from all during the 1500s. You'll have many, the Geneva's Bible and the Bishop's Bible and the Great Bible and Richard Taverner's Bible and Matthew's Bible and all of that. You'll have that from Tyndale to, let's say, 1600. And the Reims Douay Bible, you'll have that in there. Then you'll have the KJV in 1611. And that puts an end to the translation work because everyone knows they can't outdo that. And you'll have a quiet period for the next 250 years. So the 16th century, the 1500s, are the busy time. Tyndale starts it all. And after him, you won't be able to remember the dates, and you probably will not be able to remember the order of the men in which they come, starting with Tyndale. But don't worry about that. Just be familiar. If there's one thing you ought to know that the 1500s is the century. The 1500s and the 1900s are the two centuries of English Bible translations. We'll have just many of them in the 1500s. Many important ones. And then that all stops with the KJV in 1611. So we have about less than 100 years from Tyndale's work in 1526 with his Cologne, or 1525 really, with his Cologne Quarto, and then 1526 with his Worms Octavo, and then 1534 with the New Testament diligently compared and corrected from the Greek by William Tyndale, his greatest work, 1534, and from that to 1611, many different works. Well, toward the end of his life, Tyndale made the free city of Antwerp in Belgium his home. But the surrounding territories controlled by the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V. And Charles V this time is in agreement with the Roman See. So that makes all of the territory surrounding his now selected and chosen home, Antwerp, in Belgium, very dangerous territory. In other words, you're pretty much under city arrest. You can hardly leave this is a free city, so the Protestants live here, just like they did in Geneva. They live here in Antwerp. But to leave the city is to put your life in the hands of the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V. Well, you don't have to leave the city. He can send spies into the city, which he does. And Tyndale is kidnapped on May the 21st, 1535. All of these dates are certain here. Most of these dates, as we work our way in relatively modern times, are certain. He's kidnapped May the 21st, 1535, from Antwerp, from his home in Antwerp. And he is taken to a dungeon just north of Brussels. Now you remember that about this time, Henry VIII has taken his second wife, Anne Boleyn, who has Protestant leanings. So his marriage with her kind of causes a falling out between Henry VIII and the Roman papacy. We know that Thomas More has fallen out of the king's graces, soon to be executed. We know that Thomas Cromwell has risen in his place. So things are going fairly well for the Protestants in England at this time, basically because of Henry VIII's second marriage. Of course, you're not supposed to marry more than once as far as the Roman Catholics are concerned. And certainly don't marry someone like Anne Boleyn. So anyway, Thomas Cromwell tries to secure Tyndale's release. Henry VIII tries to secure Tyndale's release. Now that's an about-face change for Henry VIII and his thoughts of William Tyndale. He had been warned by all the events going on in the continent, if we don't stop Tyndale and his translation work, Lutheranism will invade the British Isles. But both the work of Cromwell as well as Henry VIII are to no avail. Tyndale had lived and worked away from his home for 10 years. and he was due also to die away from his home as well. Now, in the middle of last century, the middle of the 1800s, to skip ahead, a letter came to light, written in Tyndale's hand in Latin. And it's most definitely a genuine autograph of William Tyndale. Now, I don't know whether you remember this or not, but I read this letter to you, just about 4 years ago. It's funny how we're always crossing back over previously trodden paths. Biblical Lit tape number 3. We're on 154 this morning. That was tape number 3. And that was about the methods and materials of writing. We were discussing papyri and parchment and how the materials were used. And F.F. Bruce starts off his book entitled The Books and the Parchments, as a matter of fact, the first page of the first chapter, with a reference to this letter of Tyndale, because it's remarkable. It has remarkable similarities with certain statements made by Paul in the last letter that we have that he wrote during his life. So I'm going to read this letter to you again. Now it'll mean more to you because we know more of this man, William Tyndale. Then we had studied it pretty much from the point of view of comparing it with some statements over in 2 Timothy that Paul made, because they seem to be very similar. But now you have a feel for this man, what a genuinely Christian man this William Tyndale is, and how diligently he worked to come out with these translations. This is the last winter of his life. He's arrested in the spring of 1535. So this is the 1535-1536 winter. He's in this dungeon now, a little bit north of Brussels. And he's writing to some local authority. We really don't know who it is. Bruce suggests some marquis, but some local authority trying to not secure release really, but secure a little help. He writes, "I believe, right worshipful, that you are not unaware of what may have been determined concerning me. Wherefore I beg your lordship, and that by the Lord Jesus, that if I am to remain here through the winter," by the way, there's the use of lordship. We talked about kurios the other night. We wouldn't beg someone's lordship today, but it would certainly be proper because this is small l. I beg your lordship, and that by the Lord Jesus, capital L there. That if I am to remain here through the winter, must be late fall or early winter, you will request the commissary to have the kindness to send me, for the goods of mine which he has, a warmer cap, for I suffer greatly from cold in the head, and am afflicted by a perpetual catarrh, which is his nose is all stopped up, which is much increased in this cell. A warmer coat also, for this which I have is very thin. Piece of cloth too, to patch my leggings. My overcoat is worn out. My shirts also are worn out. He has a woolen shirt, if he will be good enough to send it. I have also with him leggings of thicker cloth to put on above. He also has warmer nightcaps. And I ask to be allowed to have a lamp in the evening. It is indeed wearisome sitting alone in the dark. But most of all I beg and beseech your clemency to be urgent with the commissary, that he will kindly permit me to have the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew grammar, and the Hebrew dictionary, that I may pass the time in that study. In return, may you obtain what you most desire, so only that it be for the salvation of your soul. But if any other decision has been taken concerning me to be carried out before winter, I will be patient, abiding the will of God, to the glory of the grace of my Lord Jesus Christ, whose Spirit, I pray, may ever direct your heart. Amen. W. Tyndale, William Tyndale. Well, he's freezing to death there, or he suspects that he's going to freeze to death. He's going to die of exposure if he doesn't have better clothes before winter comes. Seems like he's really not too concerned about the clothes, except they're a means to an end, as Bruce, I think, correctly notes here. He wants the clothes to stay warm so he can live longer, so he can work more. And you know that we've talked about his Old Testament work. He hasn't done very much of the Old Testament. He has a long way to go. He's completed his New. He's completed it revised and corrected in 1534. And then in the next year, in 1535, before his arrest here, it's the New Testament yet once again corrected by William Tyndale according to the Greek. Not as good as the 1534, but he's done the New Testament. Now notice he's concentrating a Hebrew lexicon, a Hebrew grammar, and a Hebrew dictionary. Wants to get into Hebrew more and do some more translating work, which evidently will be, as far as he knows, the last winter of his life. And if you'll turn in your Bible, we did this earlier, 4 years ago, to 2 Timothy 4, Amen. Verses 6 through 13. We don't know that Tyndale is on purpose paralleling himself with Paul in his last episode and last letter, but there certainly are similarities here. Asking for cloaks, certain type of garments come first, and then asking for some biblical material to do some reading or some translating or writing or what, we don't know. But this is Paul's last letter. 2 Timothy 4:6. For I am already being poured out like a drink offering. The time has come for my departure. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. Do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia. Titus has gone to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. I sent Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, here's where it really seems similar. Bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, and my scrolls, especially the parchments. Surely something to do with the Old Testament. I mean, Paul, this is the new that he's writing here, so he's not asking for 1 Timothy to be sent to him. Surely this has to do with the Old Testament. So what's Paul wanting? He's wanting some Hebrew manuscripts here. They were generally written on the parchments. He wants some Hebrew manuscripts. What is it Tyndale wants? A Hebrew lexicon, a Hebrew dictionary, a Hebrew grammar. Very similar circumstances in these men's lives. And similar, moreover, in the fact that after they write these letters, they both end up dead. Now this note that I've just read from Tyndale had lain unread for over 300 years. It was just discovered last century. So, in August of 1536, he does live through the winter, by the way. Those clothes must have made it to him. We can gather that because in August of 1536, he's found guilty of heresy. He's tried and found guilty of heresy. And on October the 6th, 1536, he was strangled and then burned at the stake. Almost brings tears to my eyes. What other human beings, what other professing Christians, the Roman Catholics did it, could do to this man William Tyndale. October the 6th, 1536, he was strangled and then burned at the stake. And most of you have heard of Fox's little Book of Martyrs, and some modern scholars have disputed the reliability of some of the reports in Fox's book, but Fox was a scholar himself, and I think a lot of what Fox has to say is certainly true, and other conservative scholars believe that a lot of the details that you'll find in that little paperback Fox's Book of Martyrs is true. And Fox gives us this statement concerning William Tyndale. Fox tells us that his last dying words as he was being strangled was, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Of course, that'd be a statement that, just like Jesus in his last words and crying out and so forth, would be reported by, well, disciples of his, the women that would have heard that, as well as people like that centurion. So we shouldn't think but that we have people here who witnessed the martyrdom of William Tyndale, who vividly, I mean, you couldn't help but remember that, who vividly remember this man's dying words. Lord, open the King of England's eyes. Now remember, Tyndale has been in prison ever since the spring of the following year, or the preceding year, May of 1535. He's been there about a year and a half. So it's not known whether or not Tyndale knew at this time, although the odds are he evidently did not know, that the King of England, Henry VIII, had fallen out of favor with the Roman Pope. He had married Anne Boleyn, and that just a few months prior to Tyndale's death, an entire English Bible, not just a New Testament, an entire printed English Bible was actually circulating freely in England under the consent of King Henry VIII. So Tyndale prayed a prayer that evidently God had already answered some months prior to him praying it. And obviously if Tyndale was aware of all of this, he wouldn't have prayed the prayer, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. He certainly felt him to be the same king that had shown himself to be a certain way toward Tyndale all the time, which was a strong, strong Roman Catholic. So he certainly, just from that point I just made, Tyndale never would have prayed the prayer unless he assumed that the King of England's eyes were not open to Protestantism, that he was still a Roman Catholic. So God actually had answered William Tyndale's prayer back while he's still in prison. Before he even has time to pray it, God's already working all of this out. So Tyndale comes to an untimely death. We wish he had been around long enough to give us a complete Old Testament as well. That's reserved for the next man we'll begin discussing here in a moment. But let me just conclude by saying a few things that I think I've already said about William Tyndale, but I just want to make the point again. I've really appreciated reading some of this material about him, and I hope you've enjoyed learning some about him. That I personally rank William Tyndale as the greatest of all English Bible translators. I know I've said that before, but I just want to make the point again. I rank him greater than Wycliffe or his associates, greater than any single man on the KJV committee or the RV committee or the NIV committee or anything, just because of the multifaceted role that he played, writing so much work, fleeing from home, living away from his mother country for a decade and dying away from home as well, giving us so much, as you already know, 9/10 of the KJV New Testament. So I rank him as the greatest of the English Bible translators. I think by virtue of the fact that that was the start of modern translations as we have them, it will never be duplicated. Therefore, we'll never have someone as great as William Tyndale again unless the English language just dies out and all the books and manuscripts are destroyed and someone starts over. We'll never have someone that compares to William Tyndale. So if your name is William or Tyndale, you've been named properly. After the right man, I guess. Now, we've done a lot of firsts, and we're coming to our last of firsts in English Bible translations this morning. So let me list these for you. I have 7 of them. This kind of just covers, again, what we've looked at over the last few weeks and months, all the way through Tyndale, as a matter of fact. As a matter of fact, up into the next man that we'll discuss this morning. Let's look at some firsts, so you kind of have an outline before you of the order in which this has come in the English language. We have our first attempt. That was all it was an attempt, by Kedman. Remember, he's the poet who's afraid to, with his funny sounding voice, to sing around the campfire. And he stole away to sleep in the stable, and he has this dream, and you know how that goes. He gives us an Old English metrical paraphrase. He's saying of things first created. Some of this wording you probably will remember. And that's somewhere around 680. There's our first English attempt. And if you don't remember why it took so long to have a first attempt, well, you can go back and look in your notes. We explained why it took so long before we have our first attempt. We have all of our other language attempts centuries prior to this, and English is one of the last ones to come on the scene. That was just an attempt. So secondly, we have our first actual translation. Our first actual translation by Aldhelm. Aldhelm. By Aldhelm. And that was the Psalter done around 700. And of course all of this is in Old English. So then thirdly, we have our first Middle English partial translation. So it's really the beginning of the Middle English phase of English Bible translations. Our first Middle English partial translation by Ormulum, O-R-M-U-L-U-M, which is around 1200, and it was also a paraphrase, a poetical paraphrase. As you know, most of these early ones were. They were poetical or metrical paraphrases of Matthew through Acts. So even if you don't remember all of these dates, now as I mention these names, I'm sure they're familiar in your mind now. It's not like this is the first time. It's at least the second time that you've heard these names. But you kind of know just general things about English translations, that it took a long time. The Latin and all these others start right after the first century, but it takes a long time before English even begins. When it begins, what characterizes them? They're metrical paraphrases. They're poetry. They're not a strict translation. So you're kind of familiar with that. So you're familiar with a lot of the what's the word I'm trying to say? Generalities. You're familiar with the generalities of the whole process of the translation of the English Bible. And to know that is to know a lot. To know that is to know something important, because you can, those are pegs that you can hang facts on then. All you got to do is learn a little more about that, and you know the process. You know the divisions in this period. And so then next of all, we have our first really significant Middle English translation. That number 3 was just a partial one. Here's and it was symmetrical or poetical paraphrase. So we have our first really significant Middle English translation done by Wycliffe's assistants. 1380 to 1388. Done by Wycliffe's assistants. Remember what those two men's names were? You had 2 of them, remember, that came out. Well, we'll go on. Number 5. Well, just wait till we get into the 1500s here. You'll really be confused with all of these names. The first printed, so we have to come after printing press, and all of this is hand done, manuscripts as we would call them. The first printed partial English Bible. We're trying to give it to you in the order in which significant steps were taken with the English Bible. The first printed partial English Bible was, of course, Tyndale's Cologne Quarto. 1525, and then you can throw in the Worms Octavo, 1526, because they all pretty much come there at the same time. So Tyndale is the one responsible. And if you wonder, now, why did it take so long? First of all, after Wycliffe did his work, a century and a half there, and then secondly, after the invention of the printing press, 3/4 of a century. Well, we discussed that as well, why there was such a time lapse in between all of this. Then in the 6th place, we have our first complete printed Bible. That was just our first printed partial English Bible. We have our first complete printed Bible in English. That means Old and New Testament. By Coverdale. The man we will discuss, we'll begin with him anyway this morning. 1535. Notice that's during Tyndale's lifetime, because I said a complete Bible was already in circulation under the approval of Henry VIII before Tyndale was actually martyred. And then number 7, and this pretty much rounds it out for us, the first complete English Bible printed, similar to number 6 so far, in England. This is actually done in England. All the other work's done on the continent. The first complete English Bible actually printed on English soil. Took from the time Paul wrote his epistles to the year 1537. A millennium and a half before we have a Bible printed in English on English soil. Also done by Coverdale. So we go from our first attempt, just an attempt, to our first complete English Bible printed in the English land. Now both of these last two, Numbers 6 and 7, were done by Coverdale. So let's begin discussing him. Let's give a little of his biography. And we probably won't go very long this morning because I don't even want to start into his translation, because that would be, that's a lot of material in itself. That would take me beyond my allotted 60 minutes, so we'll just give you a little biography of him and his life. He lived from somewhere around 1488, so 100 years, almost precisely after the death of Wycliffe, 1488 to 1568. He was born in Yorkshire, England. He was schooled at Cambridge, while Erasmus was professor of Greek, visiting professor of Greek and divinity at Cambridge. Tyndale, remember, missed him, because Tyndale's older than Coverdale. And just the names, Wycliffe, Tyndale, and Coverdale, those three, because those are the first three big ones, are easy to confuse. If you hear me say Tyndale, know that from now on I'm talking about Coverdale. So we actually get some of his Greek learning. Tyndale had gotten his from Richard Crowe, and he was a good Greek scholar, but Erasmus certainly had to be one of the leading Greek scholars of the world of that day. And so Miles Coverdale actually has the benefit of studying Greek while Erasmus is a visiting professor at Cambridge. Then Miles is ordained into the priesthood, of course the Roman Catholic priesthood. Remember, they all start off this way, in 1514. And then later he becomes an Augustinian monk, joins the Augustinian order and becomes a monk. And then sometime the 1520s, probably the 1520s, through the influence of the reformer Robert Barnes, he accepts and embraces the doctrines of Martin Luther, and so joined wholeheartedly the Protestant Reformation. That's sometime in the 1520s. Now, we kind of know what Tyndale is. See, Tyndale is just starting his work. He's trying to find some place in London or somewhere in England where he can do his work, where someone will finance his work and he'll actually have a place to do it. Meanwhile, God's preparing another man who also is going to be doing some work. We know in the year 1528, Miles Coverdale publicly begins to preach against Roman Catholic dogma. He's still a part of the Catholic Church by this time. In his doctrine, he's wholeheartedly joined the Protestant Reformation. But as you know from your own experience, you don't just accept that and then leave your church the next day. I mean, we should, but most of us, it didn't happen that way. Someone convinced us of the truth, and we hung around in that old bar room or that dead cemetery for a pretty long time before we ever actually got out. So he's embracing Protestant doctrine, but it's not until 1528 that he publicly begins to preach against such things as the Mass. These were three specific things he preached against. The Mass, he said, was antichrist and heretical. The confessional was antichrist and heretical. And so was the worship of images. Now, he could have picked many other things. He had a whole basket full to pick from, but he chose these three. These were three that must have really bothered him in his study of the Scriptures and bothered his conscience. So he preached against the Mass, the confessional, and the worship of images. Then he leaves the monastery and the priesthood. If he wouldn't have left, of course, you would have been thrown out, so he really does nothing good. Should have left years before that. He's charged by Cuthbert Tunstall, the Bishop of London, of heresy in 1528, and so he had to flee England to the continent, falling right on the tail of William Tyndale. He had to flee England to the continent in 1528. Now, the years 1529 to 1535, those are some important years in Tyndale's life because he gives us his two corrected editions of the Bible. But these years in Coverdale's life, 1529 to 1535, are not totally clear as to his whereabouts and his affairs. There are only a couple of things that we're certain about during these 6 or 7 years here. We're not really for sure what all he's doing. He's doing some type of preparatory work for his translation that comes later. But this much is fairly certain. He meets William Tyndale at Hamburg in 1529. Well, that's the year that he left England, so he needs to go and join the company of someone in like circumstances. Tyndale's an old pro at this by now. So it would do his heart good and well to be able to meet William Tyndale, spend some time with him. So he goes and spends some time with Tyndale at Hamburg in 1529, and while there he helps him translate some of the Pentateuch. And again, another thing that you're seeing in this is how all these men are somehow related or knew one another. From Martin Luther to William Tyndale to Miles Coverdale, they all know one another. To Erasmus, these guys, to Thomas More, to Thomas Cromwell, to Thomas Cranmer, to Henry VIII, all these famous figures in English history, as well as continental history, continental European history, they know one another, they're familiar with one another in their works. It's not surprising to us today, but when we study it from our point of view, sometimes we study it a man at a time as detached from his local environment and the historical context in which he comes. Then he was an assistant of Tyndale and a proofreader at Antwerp in 1534. Remember, this is a city which Tyndale had chosen as his place of residence at the end of his life because it was a free city. So he's kind of moving around. You see, we don't know if he was with Tyndale from 1529 to 1534. He may well have been. But we just don't know his whereabouts. He just pops up and then disappears, his name in books and letters and things. We know that he met Tyndale at Hamburg in 1529 and did some work with him there. And then we know that he did serve as Tyndale's assistant and his proofreader at Antwerp in 1534. And I guess it would be semi-safe to assume that Miles Coverdale had been with William Tyndale the whole time, from 1529 to 1534. Wherever Tyndale had gone, remember George Joy is not too good to him anymore, because what's that, around 1530 that George Joy comes out with some of his pirate editions, remember. And so that breaks any relationship between William Tyndale and his former assistant, George Joy. So he needs a new assistant, and Miles Coverdale would be a good choice. Now, let's get back to England, and let's get back into some of the political details. I know we have to go back and forth. We'll get back into the political details, and we'll just touch on that a little bit. We'll be through this morning, and we'll always be coming back to these political details, because they're all intertwined with the religious events of England and the continent. You know what's happened with Henry and the Pope. You know what's happened with Thomas More. He's executed by this time. You know that Cromwell has come on the scene. We have another Thomas, or three important Thomases in England during this time. Thomas More comes first, then Thomas Cromwell comes second, then Thomas Cranmer, or Cranmer, C-R-A-N-M-E-R, is the third Thomas. So it's easy to get them confused if you just go by their names, not if you go by their religious beliefs. Thomas More was a Catholic, and the next two were Protestants. Thomas Cranmer became the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533. We have a tremendous change in the attitude of the government of England toward the Roman Catholic Church, and therefore toward Protestantism during this time. Although it seems like they still really don't like Lutheranism as such, with all of its invectives against the Pope, and William Tyndale's "the Pope's bull slayeth more than Aaron's calf," and all of this stuff. They want it toned down a little bit, which is, I guess, to be understood when you've come out of that and been in that all of your life. But be that as it may, Cranmer becomes the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533. And then in December of 1534, we have an important convocation at Westminster. The convocation of the church or ecclesiastical divines, as well as some of the political leaders. Many times they were the same, of course. a convocation at Westminster in December of 1534, just a year now after Cranmer has become the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury. And this assembled group of divines asks Henry VIII for the following. They ask that His Majesty would vouchsafe to decree that the sacred Scriptures should be translated into the English tongue by certain honest and learned men, named for that purpose by His Majesty, and should be delivered to the people according to their learning. Now, you remember the constitutions of Oxford had forbidden anything like this many, many years before. And so this is kind of revoking the constitutions of Oxford, which had come so many years before. It goes way back to the time of Wycliffe. So the convocation at Westminster then pretty much revokes the earlier laws. Thomas Cromwell, who is the right-hand man of the king at this time, who's replaced Thomas More, is probably the man most responsible for this new change in attitudes, because he's the one who helps to arrange matters so that Coverdale can begin his translation work in 1534 on the continent. Now, he's probably still at Antwerp, since that's where he left him last. This is actually prior to the arrest of Tyndale. So we don't know what the relationship was between the two men. Who knew what at this time? Because as I said earlier, why would Tyndale be praying, Lord, open the King of England's eyes, if this last year but prior to his arrest, he knows all of these events that are taking place? Maybe the two men now have separated, probably, not out of any bad purpose or reason, but they just separated, and so Tyndale has lost contact through Miles Coverdale with what's going on in England at this time. But all we know is that Thomas Cromwell does help arrange matters so that Coverdale is able to start his translation work on the continent, somewhere on the continent. Maybe he's moved in the latter part of 1534 from Antwerp, and that would take him out of the realm of William Tyndale. But anyway, somewhere on the continent in 1534. And then in October of 1535, that's about a half a year after Tyndale's arrest and about a year prior to his death. So Tyndale is still alive. In October of 1535, a year prior to Tyndale's death, he dies in October of 36, Miles Coverdale, spelled just like it sounds, Miles Coverdale, gives us our first complete English Bible to be printed. Old and New Testaments. Tyndale just gave us the new. The first complete, and there's the important word to underline, the first complete Bible. The first complete English Bible to be printed. Not in England now. That'll be 2 years later when he holds that distinction. On the continent, probably in either Cologne or Zurich, but you'll get conflicting evidence on which city. Cologne or Zurich. Notice not Antwerp. So maybe our scenario was correct earlier. Just no one really knows what's going on with all of these men. But maybe he has left Antwerp in 1534 prior to beginning his work. So Tyndale wouldn't even know anything about it and would therefore pray the prayer, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. Somewhere on the continent, probably either Cologne or Zurich, he actually does his work. Now, it's immediately and legally imported into England. Remember, they were smuggled earlier. No smuggling now. It was immediately and legally imported into England and began to freely circulate. And then, unlike the fortunes of Tyndale, in 1535, Miles returned home to England upon the friendship of Thomas Cromwell, as well as the new Queen, Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn, B-O-L-E-Y-N, her name will pop up here and there. Anne Boleyn is the second wife of Henry VIII. We'll say more about some of her views maybe next time. But Anne Boleyn now, many times women you see have important influences on their men. And she has a very important, and in this regard, a goodly important influence upon Henry VIII. She doesn't last very long. Henry's kind of a fickle king as well as a fickle husband. But anyway, she seems to help turn things toward Protestantism. She happens to be the mother of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, we all know of Elizabethan England. Well, that comes right after the time of Henry and Anne, some other wives that Henry had. But she's most important, I guess, because she's the mother of Queen Elizabeth, one of the greatest queens, Queen Elizabeth, one of the greatest queens of England. And Queen Elizabeth is on the scene, in the late 1500s up until around 1603 or 1604, just prior to the KJV. And then, of course, James comes as king. He comes from Scotland, where he'd been king like 36 years in Scotland, and he comes to England. He becomes King of England as well as King of Scotland. So Miles comes back home because he's friends with Cromwell and Anne Boleyn, but then she's executed right after this, and Cromwell fell from power, and so Coverdale has to flee England again in 1540. He's allowed to stay in England 5 years. And then we have another upheaval, another religious and political upheaval, intrigue in the court of King Henry. Cromwell falls from power. Anne Boleyn is murdered. And Coverdale flees to the continent, where he remains until Henry's dead and Edward VI becomes king in 1547. And then the next leader will be Queen Elizabeth right after this, the next significant leader, after Edward VI. Edward VI becomes king, and Henry dies in 1547, which will again change the political as well as the religious atmosphere and fortunes of the English people.